And police in Italy are investigating possible arson after a fire destroyed more than a dozen Tesla vehicles. Elon Musk is calling the incident at a Rome dealership terrorism. This comes as Tesla has been the target of recent protests around the world.
What if I told you that the global energy map has been turned upside down, and America no longer holds the keys to the world's energy security? It all started with one contract, a deal that truly shook the global oil and gas markets. The Canadian Trans Mountain Pipeline, a source of national pride that was supposed to lead to victory, became the catalyst that paved the way for new players: China, India, and of course, Canada itself, which, as it turned out, had been preparing for this moment for a long time. At that moment, America began to lose its former confidence. Energy, which was considered the strongest foundation of U.S. economic power, was now under threat. Why did this happen, and who ended up in a winning position while Trump was announcing new oil tariffs? We will examine the answers to these questions today.
US President Donald Trump has announced a 25% tariff on all car and light truck imports into the country. It's due to come into effect on April 2nd. Economists and world leaders are warning that it will be a tax on consumers and have a chilling effect on the global economy. But to Americans, Trump paints a rosy picture, predicting that the levies will spur growth.
US President Donald Trump, confident that economic pressure on Canada would lead to the desired result, announced the introduction of 10% tariffs on Canadian oil. His calculation was simple: squeeze his neighbor, force him to make concessions, and get oil back into American pipelines. However, no one expected that there would be a much larger game behind this. Instead of giving in, Canada, like a true strategist, had long been developing a plan B. Chinese and Indian investors, multi-billion-dollar contracts that would open new avenues for Canadian oil. Canadian oil will no longer depend on Washington's political will. It will now become a free player on the world market. The scandal was not long in coming. The US, proud of its energy advantage, was faced with a dramatic change in the global economic and political landscape. While Trump continued to talk about American power, quiet but very important work was going on in the highest offices of Canada. China, a country that does not like loud statements, acted ahead of the curve, signing deals and creating infrastructure that allowed it to freely manipulate oil and gas prices.
After Trump imposed those sweeping 25% tariffs on aluminum and steel imports, the European Union retaliating with tariffs on up to $28 billion of U.S. goods. Trump making it clear this isn't over, vowing to respond in kind with sweeping retaliatory tariffs early next month.
But most importantly, while all eyes were on foreign policy maneuvers, a real economic crisis was unfolding within America itself. Refining capacity, dependent on cheap Canadian oil, began to collapse. Suddenly, across the country, the price of gasoline rose by 80 cents a gallon, and everyone felt the blow. But that was only the beginning. Problems in the US oil markets began to spread to other sectors of the economy.
With Elon Musk's views on weighing into very much national politics, national elections in Europe. And then on top of that, when you see the backdrop of Tesla upgrading its product line and the impact of them trying to chase more sales at the back end of last year, that means it's short on inventory. It can't necessarily sell as many vehicles or doesn't have as many in stock to sell. So there is that issue there of a confluence of impacts, which means that sales have been falling. Again, the question is how much more that will impact into February as well, given that the back end of last year in 2024, Tesla sales did slip overall.
What next? Canada did not stop at oil alone. In 2025, they began to prepare a real energy storm, a project to export liquefied natural gas, which not only eclipsed US exports, but also built new international partnerships. The US, finding itself isolated, began to realize that its dominance in the energy sector was rapidly crumbling. In this video, we will discuss how one strategic move by Canada and China put America in an awkward position. Who now holds the keys to global energy security, and how will the US respond? Pay attention, because not only energy is at stake, but also the future of the global economy.
That's a 10. That's a good one. Yeah.
The beginning of 2025 was a turning point for the global energy industry. One of the most important oil flows was snatched from under America's nose, and the whole world was shocked by an unexpected deal that changed the balance of power in the energy sector. And it all happened thanks to Canada and its Trans Mountain pipeline system. This oil artery, which was supposed to become a symbol of the country's energy independence, instead of promoting stability, became a turning point that opened the door to China and India. Before Washington had time to understand what was happening, the new energy was already flowing not to the American market, but to Asia. This came as a real shock to the US. Its long-standing dependence on cheap Canadian oil, which gave American petrochemical companies a competitive advantage, was under threat.
After weeks of whiplash, Trump threatening tariffs, imposing some and walking back others, many Americans are feeling the uncertainty. In Swisher, Iowa, distillery owner Jeff Quint says it's paralyzing.
The bourbon industry is going to be collateral damage in this tariff war. I don't really think there's any way around that.
And he's not alone. Tonight, the majority of Americans, 61%, now say they disapprove of how the president is handling tariffs. 56% say they disapprove of his handling of the economy overall. But the president has dismissed those concerns tonight, saying he has the right to change course.
America had always believed that its energy security was sacrosanct. The strength of the dollar, its enormous influence on the global oil and gas market, and the power of the American oil industry all ensured its primacy. But with the launch of Trans Mountain in 2025, when Canadian oil began to flow freely to Asian markets for the first time, the US found itself in danger of losing control over one of the most important parts of its economy. While the US oil industry depended on cheap Canadian raw materials, new agreements with Asian countries forced Canadian suppliers to abandon their old partners. The intrigue began to grow when Chinese corporations started signing deals with Canadian energy giants, securing guaranteed oil supplies at prices significantly higher than what the US was used to paying for Canadian oil. Few people knew that such steps had been in the works for a long time. In 2024, when negotiations between the US and Canada over tariffs became heated, work was already underway behind the scenes to reconnect to new markets. One high-profile Canadian analyst said in a private interview, "We have known for a long time that if tariffs were increased or pressure from the US intensified, we would have to look for new outlets for our oil. China offered us terms that we could not ignore." Unlike their American counterparts, Chinese businesses were much more flexible and willing to enter into long-term contracts without political interference, which ensured stable supplies and prices. This conclusion also had a strategic aspect. Canadian oil could now compete directly with Saudi Arabian and Russian oil in Asia, making it an important player in new energy markets. The focus on Asia paid off when Chinese oil giants such as Sinopec signed multi-billion-dollar contracts with Canadian companies such as Suncor and Canadian Natural Resources Limited. These deals involved not only long-term supplies, but also guaranteed transportation routes that bypassed US territory, significantly reducing Canada's dependence on its neighbor. While US officials tried to rally efforts to draw the Canadian market into their network, China and India, in turn, found themselves in a winning position. This moment became crucial when Canadian oil began to disappear from the shelves of American petrochemical plants and was replaced by oil from less stable regions such as Venezuela and Saudi Arabia. With their high political risks and uncertain supplies,
we begin with the president's trade war escalating tonight. This evening, the retaliation against the United States, Canada, and the European Union responding quickly, just hours after President Trump's 25% tariff on all steel and aluminum coming into the United States. Canada, the largest supplier of steel to the U.S., slapping new tariffs on $20 billion worth of U.S. goods that are sold in Canada. And the 27 countries of the European Union imposing retaliatory tariffs on up to $28 billion worth of U.S. goods sold in Europe.
Trump, as a true believer in American supremacy, was confident in his strategy. He believed that imposing a 10% tariff on Canadian oil in 2024 would force Canada to back down and return oil to American pipelines. However, the reality turned out to be different. Instead of bowing to pressure, Canada began looking for ways around it. The expected Canadian capitulation did not happen. This came as a shock to the Trump administration. Meanwhile, Canadian oil companies such as Suncor and Cenovus realized that high rates for Americans were an opportunity for them to tap into Asian markets. The Chinese market stood in the way of Canadian oil, and this move proved to be strategically correct. Thanks to flexible contracts and opportunities to resell oil along the way, China was able to buy Canadian oil at a higher price, while American companies continued to struggle with political problems. The key factor was a change in the structure of the deals themselves. In the past, Canadian oil was sold at a fixed price that depended on world market prices and tariffs. However, the new scheme allowed Canadian exporters to move oil along the route, selecting the best buyers at each stage. China, having secured flexibility in its deals, began to profit from reselling Canadian oil, earning between $2.00 and $3.00 per barrel. The US found itself at a disadvantage. Its petrochemical companies were unable to agree to such terms, and the US effectively lost the price control it had previously enjoyed.
I think you're going to remember today, it's going to be a free nation that we're dealing with. We're going to have a very free and beautiful nation. It's going to be Liberation Day in America, and it's going to be a day that hopefully you're going to look back in years to come and you're going to say, you know, he was right. This has turned out to be one of the most important days in the history of our country.
However, what was the decisive factor in this shift? The fact is that long before the launch of Trans Mountain, Canada had already begun preparing for a break with the US. By building its economy on long-term partnerships with Asia, Canada managed to push its oil into the world's fastest-growing markets. And as soon as Canada finalized its contracts with China and India, the US was faced with a fait accompli. The loss of cheap Canadian oil was not just an economic disaster, but also a geopolitical setback. In the next step, despite threatening statements from the White House, Canada continued to strengthen its independence, and Chinese and Indian buyers took an increasing share of the market every month. And as soon as America realized that it was losing this energy market, it was too late. When Canadian oil giants began signing long-term contracts with Chinese, Indian, and Japanese buyers, they knew that their actions would have enormous consequences for the global energy balance. Canadian authorities and corporations carefully prepared for a break with the US, realizing that in the long term, dependence on the American oil and gas market would become unprofitable and risky. However, what they did was a real revolution in the energy sector. Chinese and Indian buyers began to conclude deals that not only changed financial flows, but also determined the strategic position in the global energy sector. These contracts were not simple oil supply agreements. Canadian companies offered their new Asian partners unique terms, so-called freeboard or FBO contracts. The idea was that once the oil was shipped from a Canadian port, its further route could be changed depending on where the greatest demand and the highest price arose at any given moment. This innovation was radically different from traditional contracts, under which the buyer received oil tied to a fixed route. With such contracts, Canadian oil could move from one continent to another, from one country to another, thereby guaranteeing the most favorable conditions for its sellers. Thus, China and India became not just buyers, but participants in a global game where each deal could be redirected depending on the market situation.
Ready? The higher the tariff, the more likely it is that the company will come into the United States and build a factory in the United States so it doesn't have to pay the tariff.
That will take many, as you know, that will take many years.
In fact, I'll tell you, there's another theory is that the tariff, you make it so high, so horrible, so obnoxious that they'll come right away. When I do the 10%, 10% is really, first of all, 10% when you collect it is hundreds of billions of dollars. The numbers that you're talking, all reducing our deficit. But really, so there's two ways of looking at a tariff. You can do it as a money-making instrument, or you can do it as something to get the companies. Now, if you want the companies to come in.
However, Canada's choice of Asia as a strategic partner was dictated not only by economic considerations, but also by political calculations. Unlike the US, which, as the tariff situation showed, was prone to manipulation based on political pressure, China and India offered Canada more stable and long-term conditions that were entirely satisfactory to both sides. It was no longer necessary to rely on American petrochemical plants, which could let Canada down at any moment due to changing tariffs or the political will of Washington. Chinese and Indian oil giants offered Canada large sums of money for stable oil supplies, as well as long-term contracts with guaranteed prices. This step was a turning point when Canada finally decided to end its energy dependence on the US. Against the backdrop of these innovations in energy policy, America was gradually gripped by shock. The US, accustomed to its status as the largest consumer of Canadian oil, was unprepared for such an unexpected move. While Washington continued to build its plans around the threat of tariffs and attempts to pressure Canada, Asian and European countries were already signing contracts that ensured their long-term energy security. Thus, Canada ceased to be the number one supplier to the US and began to build its own energy future, in which new, more profitable partnerships with Asian countries took center stage. Moreover, Canada managed not only to strengthen its position in the foreign market, but also to guarantee itself complete energy independence. Canada created a so-called energy safety cushion by investing heavily in the modernization of its energy sector and in infrastructure that allowed it to supply oil and gas not only to America, but also to the world's fastest-growing economic regions. The Global Market Acceleration Program, launched in 2024, proved to be a key element in the creation of these new partnerships. Public and private investors poured nearly $6.5 billion 0 cents into export development, with $5 billion 0 cents of that going to support Canadian oil companies, which could now be assured of long-term lucrative contracts with Asian countries. One high-profile Canadian official who wished to remain anonymous commented, "We understood that the old world of energy relations with the US had come to an end. Now is the time for a new world order, where there will be no place for unilateral control by America."
Tariffs, there's been a lot of on and off, some inconsistency.
There's no inconsistency. I'm not like a block that just, I won't delay. It's called flexibility. It's not called inconsistency. It's called flexibility.
The real threat to the US was that old economic ties were beginning to break down and new partners were starting to act without regard for American interests. Canada, with its political and economic independence, was no longer just the number one supplier for American companies. It had become an independent energy player that was no longer dependent on external pressure. This was a serious blow to the American oil industry, which had grown accustomed to cheap Canadian oil and gas and now faced real competition. Meanwhile, the situation in the US continued to deteriorate. Against the backdrop of severed trade relations with Canada and a sharp rise in oil and gas prices, the country's economy began to feel the effects. For most Americans, this meant higher gasoline prices, which caused discontent among the population. Analysts warned that further price increases could lead to an economic downturn. But even more serious were the consequences for American political stability. Congress began receiving reports that major petrochemical companies that had previously supported Trump's actions were now facing problems and warning of risks to their operations. More and more companies began demanding that the government review its tariff policy and find solutions to prevent an economic crisis. Canada, in turn, continued to strengthen its position by signing new agreements and receiving stable income from them. This allowed it not only to develop its economy, but also to secure political influence that now extended beyond North America. Thus, Canada's energy independence, the result of several years of careful work and strategic decisions, led to a redistribution of power on the global stage. The US, finding itself isolated, was now forced to adapt to a new world order where other players, immune to Washington's influence, came to the fore.